Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I'm Dr. Claudia Yagubi, Associate Professor of Persian Studies in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies and the Director of the Center for the Middle East and Islamic Studies. And I'm so pleased to be here tonight with you, launching our center's annual academic lecture series. And I would like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Elisabeth Leake. A little about the series. The purpose of the center's academic lecture series is to share the vast and interesting knowledge of various faculty members, while also providing a sense of community, allowing the opportunity for faculty and students from various disciplines together and provide the public community the chance to learn about our scholarship on the Middle East and Islamic studies communities. These lecture series are designed to create a campus-wide conversation and an opportunity to interact with leading scholars and members of our faculty in the field of Middle East and Islamic studies internationally and nationally. I believe that no one takes education in a vacuum seriously. Hence, we try to provide these opportunities for our graduate students to hear from those in the field and observe how they can use their degrees and what type of contributions it can make in the real world. Students can also learn what it's like to translate theory into practice, what they learn in classrooms into actual conversations with scholars in the field during these lectures. The lecture series allows students also to network with guest speakers who are often invited to partake in classroom visits in addition to their public lectures, as I know Dr. Leake did today. The entire day I hear was in classrooms. This opportunity provides students with an extraordinary exposure that they need to solidify their next steps in their academic career and to meet the people who will help them to get there. I would also like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Jamil Aydin and Yusuf Sezgin, who have coordinated this series for this year, the entire year. Dr. Aydin's interests focus on both modern Middle Eastern history and modern Asian history, with an emphasis on the international and intellectual histories of the Ottoman and Japanese empires. He is particularly interested in historical processes that shape transnational, racial, and civilizational identities, such as Muslim, Asian, African. His research and publications offer new ways to understand the historical roots of contemporary world order by describing the process of the imperial era conflicts and decolonization, especially from the perspective of non-Western actors of the Muslim world and East Asia. Other research and teaching interests deal with questions of internationalism and Orientalism and modern world history. I'll tell you a little bit about Dr. Yusuf Sezgin, who is a PhD candidate in the history department in the field of global intellectual history. He is interested in the ideas of social justice and liberation in postcolonial religious thinking, particularly Catholic and Muslim liberation theologies. In his dissertation project under the supervision of Dr. Aydin, he is looking at the religio-political ideas of Catholic and Muslim intellectuals of the global South, who articulated liberationist formulations of Catholicism and Islam during the 1960s and 70s. With their attention to the issues such as social justice, solidarity with the marginalized, and religion as a means of both personal salvation and social liberation. So I'm going to give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Aydin, to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Claudia, for initiating this lecture series. It's an exciting time for our campus. After almost 3 years of Zoom meetings, we can finally meet in person. And I want to highlight that you should check the webpage of the center. We have very exciting 6 lectures in this year. Next one is November 14 by by our colleague Caroline Elkins, who will talk about the legacy of British violence in Palestine, British Empire violence in Palestine on November 14th, on Monday, again at 5:30 to 7 o'clock in this room. And next semester's talks also will be in Nelson Mandela Auditorium. As Claudia mentioned, one of the visions of this lecture is to close the gap between scholarly understanding of the Middle East and Islamic society, Muslim societies, and the general public knowledge or public conversation about these societies. And one of the good examples is the story of Afghanistan. As Professor Leake will tell, the gap between what we know or we think about Afghanistan and what we scholars write about it is so huge that we needed an intervention on this topic. And Professor Leake wrote the most authoritative book on this topic. My hand is my favorite book, so this is also a great chance for us to host her. So let me tell you before she starts her remarks on the book. Professor Leake, after finishing Yale undergraduate, went to Cambridge University to do her PhD with Chris Bailey, late Chris Bailey, one of the leading scholars of the field. And her first book, called Defiant Borders, Afghanistan-Pakistan borders during the era of decolonization. And this book is also considered one of the classics. In fact, in another graduate seminar on this campus, our students are reading and discussing that book. So they're reading two of her books in 2 weeks. Then she started to teach at the University of Leeds. And then just this year, after 13 years in England, she came back to the United States as a distinguished professor at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And this book, I had a pleasure to read it during the book workshop era. It's one of my favorite books, and it's called Afghan Crucible, the Soviet Invasion and the Making of Modern Afghanistan. And if you ever mention Afghanistan as a graveyard of empires, we hope that after this lecture you stop doing that. So in order to understand why this is such a prejudice perception and why we need to decolonize our understanding of Afghan and world history, I would like to invite Professor Leake to give the first lecture in our series.
Let's share. There's maybe sharing. Yeah. Amazing. Super. Well, it's so exciting to be here, and I have to say thank you so much, Jamil, for the invitation. I have to say it's so exciting to be in person, talking to real people about this book rather than via Zoom. And I also have to just thank Jamil so utterly heartily, because not only has his research and work been so inspiring to me in the research that I've done, but also his advice throughout the entirety of this book project has really meant a lot to me, and has really, I think, really shaped the final book and its final product, hopefully in good ways. I can only hope that. So it's brilliant to be here. I thought what I would do is to start with a series of vignettes before kind of getting into the book's material itself. So on the 27th of April, 1978, an Afghan civil servant commemorated the military coup that had brought to power the Socialist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. And celebrating what PDP acolytes called the Sour or April Revolution, he wrote, I'll quote it here, "These are Republican days full of happiness. I cannot sleep because of happiness and delight. Everywhere there is dance and music. What beautiful nights they are when you see others free. Young people are making efforts for the well-being of the country. They are dancing and laughing, delighting in their happiness. Wake up and burn down the house of ignorance. See, every youth competes with the other." Less than 4 months later, in August, the Central Council of Jamiat-e-Islami, or the Islamic Society of Afghanistan, provided a very stark contrast when the leadership wrote an impassioned plea, which they sent to Kurt Waldheim, who at the time was the General Secretary of the United Nations. And in this letter, which is pictured here, they decried Afghanistan's recent political leaders. So this same People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, calling them, and I quote, a power-thirsty gang intent on destroying Afghanistan's political and social fabric and lacking any respect for humanitarian norms or human rights. The council went on to demand United Nations intercession, warning, and I quote, the continued survival of this group will endanger the peace of this region of the world. So Jamiat's warnings were actually mirrored then discussions taking place in Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, as well as in Washington, D.C., though for very different reasons. So in a ploy to receive foreign aid and against the background of tensions between Pakistan and the United States, as Pakistan continued to pursue a nuclear arsenal, Mohammed Zia-ul-Haq, Pakistan's military dictator, very dramatically told the United States Secretary of State that an Afghan socialist regime meant that the Soviet Union is on Pakistan's borders. In public rhetoric and announcements, American officials dismissed these claims. But back in Washington, they weren't so sure. Did the very public alliance between the PDPA and the Soviet Union signal Soviet plans to overrun Afghanistan? While American officials began debating the issue, President Jimmy Carter issued secret orders in July 1979 to begin providing covert aid to a growing body of Afghan resistance forces that sought to end Afghan socialist rule. Despite tensions, as well between the United States and its erstwhile regional ally, Pakistan, Carter's administration also then chose to work with Zia and Pakistan's inter services intelligence to begin funneling money to these Afghan resistance groups. As we now know, the move proved prescient. So on the 24th of December, 1979, the Soviet Politburo issued a public directive justifying the deployment of Soviet troops into Afghanistan to support their allies, the same PDPA or Afghan socialists. The Soviets, the Politburo claimed, sought to give international aid to the friendly Afghan people and to prevent anti-Afghan actions from neighboring countries. Within days, 50,000 Soviet troops were on the ground in Afghanistan, and they would remain there for the better part of a decade as part of Soviet efforts to keep their local allies in power. So of these vignettes, the final two, I think, are far better known than the rest. So the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan has been understood and written about in the context of the Cold War. And in this Cold War context, certainly Afghanistan in the 1980s was one of the Cold War's killing fields. It was a battlefield in the worldwide superpower competition between the United States on one hand and the Soviet Union on the other that devolved into widespread and life-shattering violence. So from this vantage then, the Soviet invasion was certainly not atypical. We could see it sitting alongside superpower interventions across the world. So running from Guatemala and the Dominican Republic through to Hungary and Czechoslovakia, Iran and Lebanon, the Philippines, Indonesia, Korea, and of course, and this was something that people talked about a lot, I would say in August last year, Vietnam. The Afghan Civil War certainly demonstrated how the Cold War shaped the so-called Third World, and not only as an event that was co-authored by the superpowers. It was a conflict that went ahead and influenced the United States and the Soviet Union's own trajectories, as well as having lingering effects across the Middle East and Asia. But while the superpower-led Cold War was certainly pervasive, it was not the only story taking place. And in this regard, I would say the PDPA activists' poem or Jamiat Islami's UN petition more than a year earlier shed equally important light onto how and why a war would break out that would engulf not just Afghanistan and Afghans, but also regional and international powers alike. So these are all stories that I highlight in my new book, Afghan Crucible, the Soviet Invasion, and the Making of Modern Afghanistan. And this project is an attempt to write a global history of the Afghan Civil War of the 1980s. So notably, the book certainly starts before the December 1979 Soviet invasion. So most obviously with this April 1978 coup that brought the Afghan socialists to power. But I also trace the conflict's local roots and events in the 1980s in the broader context of Afghanistan's longer 20th century history. What becomes clear then is that the Soviet invasion was entangled with regional power competitions, including the Sino-Soviet split, Indo-Pakistani hostilities, as well as the rise of local regimes focused on Islamization. The conflict also spurred on alternative visions of international relations that rejected US or Soviet domination, but still drew on a shared tactical playbook. And it forced Afghan actors into competition with international organizations, while Afghans' daily lives were under scrutiny by both political and physical forces alike. So in this sense, the war was as much about territory, ethnicity, and community as it was about global alliances, political aspirations, and the nature of state power. So scholars have compared the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan with other Cold War crises to demonstrate the conflict's global and violent nature. But in Afghan Crucible, I take a different approach. So instead, I examine a single conflict through the multiple perspectives of many of the local, regional, and international actors who took part. So in other words, I take a multi-scalar, multi-locational approach. Through this, each chapter offers a different lens of analysis. So each chapter examines a particular group of historical actors, often based in a specific geographical location, and then delves into the ways that they approach the war. So I've included the table of contents here, and you can see that we moved then between Kabul, Moscow, Islamabad, Peshawar, and the Panjshir Valley, which is in Afghanistan, Washington, D.C., the refugee camps along Pakistan's northwest frontier province, of which Nazarbag was the biggest refugee camp, and then we end up in Geneva. In turn, through this structure, I look at the activities and ideas of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the Afghan Socialists. I explore the role of the Kremlin and Soviet Politburo, as well as Soviet state builders on the ground in Afghanistan. I look at the role of regional state leaders headed by Pakistan, but also including Iran, India, and China. I look at the ideas and motivations of the various Afghan resistance parties, whom I'll talk about more like today. I look at the Carter and Reagan administrations, as well as the really key role played by the Central Intelligence Agency, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, their officials, and then the experiences of Afghan refugees on the ground. And finally, then I look at the role of the UN General Assembly and the UN Secretariat and the officials who were tasked with ultimately negotiating a Soviet withdrawal. So this alternative form of comparison certainly demonstrates the pervasiveness of the Cold War, but it also really emphasizes the ways that the Cold War intersected with decolonization, dynamics local to the Middle East and South and Central Asia, the rise of international organizations, and alternative ideas and ideologies that drove local actors. And what I really hope with this structure is that the book allows us to peel back and to try to disentangle some of the layers of global, regional, and local engagement with Afghan politics and society, and hopefully reveal with far greater nuance the numerous, frequently competing, but also often very interconnected motives that drove different actors who became involved in the crisis. In turn, I hope that the book serves as a call for further multi-scalar studies of the Middle East and its complicated 20th century histories. I think what becomes clear, at least from my perspective, is that we cannot disaggregate international politics from local, national, or regional issues, nor did many historical actors try to do so. Instead, they were driven by a whole host of motivating factors, and even more frequently, they had to respond to the contingencies that were spurred on by unexpected developments both at home and abroad. So local actors were often driven by the desire to reshape social and political dynamics within Afghanistan, but this also often reflected broader aspirations to redefine what it meant to be modern, whether that be a modern state, a modern nation, or a modern citizen. And this was all at a time of swift global change. So as such, the project then further interrogates how we write global histories that are attuned to the fundamentally messy nature of the past and that bring together fine-grained knowledge of a region with attention to broader regional and global trends. As an event that brought in so many historical actors from across the world, the Afghan Civil War has left a global paper trail, but not necessarily an even one. And I feel like it's always really important to talk about sources. So the actors involved in the Afghan Civil War have left behind materials that vary in their depth, focus, and accessibility. So the UN and the UNHCR, which were so involved with the Afghan refugees and refugee camps, the negotiations that led to the Soviet withdrawal, as well as the Afghan socialists' quest for international legitimation, have provided particularly rich materials. Likewise, the Reagan and Carter administrations left large amounts of reporting and data. In contrast, I largely follow the Soviet Union's state building initiatives within Afghanistan, as revealed at the State Archive of the Russian Federation, rather than focusing as strictly on top-level decision-making in Moscow, since the papers for that remain still largely classified. In exploring the regional ramifications of the Civil War, I've depended heavily on newspapers, publicly available government statements, and memoirs, as well as some state archives. However, much of the material from regional actors remains classified or very difficult to access. And I should add, as experienced researcher, my first book demonstrated, materials, for example, gained in Pakistani archives can very easily be taken away. Afghan voices and perspectives can be found in all of these materials. So both the Afghan socialists and resistance party leaders corresponded with foreign officials, they lobbied the international community, and they engaged in regional debates. As I'll show you in a moment, they also translated their manifestos into multiple languages. While many official Afghan sources from before and during the civil war were destroyed in the course of fighting in and around Kabul in the 1990s, other Afghan materials have been made available to scholars worldwide through various digital collaborations. I should say that unfortunately, I was unable to travel to Afghanistan in preparing this book, and likewise various constraints led me to prioritize learning and using Russian over Pashto and Dari. And so I think very unsurprisingly, these choices have really inevitably shaped what I've written. I cannot, and this book does not, represent, I guess, an Afghan perspective on the conflict. So I seek to explore and contextualize Afghan decision-making in ways in which large swaths of the country's population responded hostilely to socialist government reforms. But at the same time, I try not to make assertions about how or why individual Afghans responded to socialist, Islamist, or other visions of modernity in different or specific ways. So in other words, this is not an on-the-ground history of the Soviet invasion, but rather one that tries to tease out the messy interconnections between the local, the national, the regional, and the global. So how does this book then contribute to global histories of the Middle East? So the book explores the circulations of ideas and practices, the ways in which events in Afghanistan were shaped by changes in the regional landscape, as well as the intended, but more often unintended consequences of decisions taken across centers of power, both within and far beyond Afghanistan. In all of this, there's one point I'm particularly keen to emphasize. So in this conflict, we must recognize Afghans, especially the elites and intellectuals with whom I do engage, as global actors. So this book is really about positioning Afghanistan not just as a site of foreign intervention, but instead in terms of exploring ways that Afghan elites and intellectuals themselves drove the conflict. As a word of sort of context, across preceding decades and centuries, Afghanistan's economy had been rooted in trade links that expanded north, south, east, and west. Its intelligentsia shared histories and practices of poetry, literature, and language that spanned South Asia and the Middle East. Afghan leaders who joined the 1955 Afro-Asia Conference in Bandung to express racial solidarity and reject Cold War binaries, and they had also helped found the Non-Aligned Movement in 1961. So like their counterparts then across the decolonizing world, Afghan intellectuals turned to the promises of liberalism, constitutionalism, socialism, as well as Islamism as modes of shaping their country's future, as well as for shaping the international system. So tracing them, some of the networks that linked Afghans' aspirations to a broader global context sheds light then onto some of the myriad ways that, that educated Afghans, much like intellectuals across much of the decolonizing world, understood and aspired to certain forms of national and international politics. And this then I hope also helps to provide a corrective then to the idea put forward that the so-called traditionalism or localism of Afghanistan are not survivals of ancient traditions, but rather the results of the country's forced integration into the contemporary state system. So I'm really fighting against these ideas, not only of Afghanistan as a failed state, but also Afghanistan as the graveyard of empires. I think what's really important is that Afghan intellectuals and leaders, especially in the 1970s and the 80s and before that, did not see themselves as citizens of a state forced unwillingly or inappropriately into an international state system. Instead, for Afghans, as well as many of their allies across South Asia and the Middle East, Afghanistan was, as the historian Faiz Ahmed has written, an ideal conduit through which an assortment of radical political coalitions could take shape and did take shape. So Afghanistan, by shedding imperial oversight as early as 1919, taking the lead in pan-Asian and pan-Islamic anti-colonial networks, and working to establish a stable government that was rooted in constitutionalism, even while retaining its monarchy, offered for many actually the prototype for the post-colonial state, not a graveyard of empires. And Afghan reformers in that context then sought the vague but potent promise of modernity. They sought to reaffirm, but also to reform a form of statehood that married aspects of Western liberalism with Islamic and indigenous practices while embracing participation in global governance. So the simultaneously universalist and national aspirations of Afghan intellectuals and elites becomes evident then through tracing the genesis of their ideas, as well as the ways in which they attempted to implement and legitimize them. So starting in the early to mid 20th century, I traced how the Afghan socialists came to adopt Marxism-Leninism, as well as the ways that other students and staff at Kabul University also turned to political Islam, drawing on links with Al-Azhar University in Cairo, and as well as the Muslim Brotherhood. So Afghan Islamists and thinkers such as Burhanuddin Rabbani, who studied at Al-Azhar, drew inspiration from the teachings of Abdullah Maududi and Sayyid Qutb. Rabbani was even in the process of translating Qutb's works into Persian while working at Kabul University when he became one of the leaders of Jamiat Islami. Meanwhile, I guess across the political spectrum, the PDPA, also engaging in these transnational networks, often familiarized itself with Marxist-Leninist teachings through materials that had been translated by Iran's two departments, the Iranian communists, and then smuggled across the border. So in the late 1960s and early 1970s, as the promises of Afghanistan's 1964 constitution failed to materialize and opportunities for political, economic, and social change stagnated, these groups, the Afghan socialists, as well as the Afghan Islamists, amongst numerous others, actively debated the future of Afghanistan and the nature of political modernity. At that time, in the mid-1960s, the Islamists' ideas in particular were quite vague. So to quote, the overthrow of the ruling order and its replacement by the Islamic order. But they nevertheless tried to act upon this promise. So Afghan Islamists, including Jamiat, first came up against the Afghan government actually in 1975, when they tried to mobilize a rebellion against Afghanistan's then president, Muhammad Khan. Their rebellion failed, and this in turn then caused many of these Islamist leaders to actually flee to Pakistan. So it was actually in Peshawar across the border in the 1970s that these groups really organized and began to mobilize. And it was also then during this time that their ideas and practices really evolved. So in the course of the book, I discuss a lot of the diverse ways in which resistance to the Afghan socialists under Soviet backers unfolded. But I ultimately chose to focus most specifically on two organizations. So Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hizb Islami and Burhanuddin Rabbit's Jamiat Islami. So those are kind of two of the leading resistance parties in the war, in the Afghan Civil War. So the reason I focused on these two groups in particular is threefold. So firstly, as I've already alluded to, these organizations clearly predated both the 1978 coup and the 1979 invasion. So these are not groups that emerged purely as a reaction to the Soviet invasion. Secondly, focusing on these two groups in particular offers a really interesting source of comparison for thinking about Islamist governments and the different forms that it might take. You can see that I think on the screen, one of the charters has disappeared, that's okay. But you can see that with these English language translations of these organizations' charters, which they published and circulated internationally. And looking at these charters provides a really interesting sort of insight into the ideas and sort of models that were driving these figures. So Hizb Islami, for example, which you can see on that right-hand image, emphasized the significance of Sharia and madrasas as key educational centers, but they also really interestingly sought land reform and land redistribution, state oversight of all industries, and then they also pledged protection of workers' rights and better wages. In practice, Hizb Islami was highly focused, though, on one-party rule, and it readily used violence against its opponents within the resistance, not just against the Afghan socialists and the Soviets. In contrast to Hizb Islami, Jamiat was much bigger in its ambitions, but also, I think very importantly, much more inclusive in its approach. So Jamiat kind of spoke of its aspirations in much broader terms, but again, focusing on questions of sort of social and political equality, preservation of rights, and the like, but they also looked to accommodate Afghanistan's historical diversity much more than Hizb Islami did. And Jamiat really looked to build on a system of local alliances that were created in this wartime context that often then would accommodate local political and social practices across Afghanistan. So these provide sort of two different sort of models then of Islamist thought and ideas. Ooh, well, the pictures have disappeared, but that's okay. So what I hope becomes clear is the really radically modernist ambitions of these groups. I think one of the things that's really important is looking at these Islamist resistance groups is they were not looking to return Afghanistan to some pre-modern status quo. And you can particularly see this, for example, with the significance of the party as a kind of a unit of mobilization. And party structures were really critical in the ways that these groups organized and manifested their power.
And I would say kind of the centrality of party structures in particular really served to differentiate this war from earlier regime changes within Afghanistan. We can also then see kind of the modernist ambitions of these groups and the fact that these parties thought globally, not just locally, and they engage globally recognized ideas and imageries. So to give just one example, which is normally what the picture is of, but no worries, we can turn to the English language publications of the Afghan resistance groups. And they use these English language publications to effectively run a public diplomacy campaign. So for example, Jamil and his both opened their own offices in London and Los Angeles, and they circulated worldwide various English, Arabic, Dari, and Pashto language newspapers. So among these were Jamil's Mirror of Jihad and his Islami's Mujahideen Monthly. And party leaders used these publications to demonstrate the global significance of the war, to cultivate further support, and to begin discussing then these different models of Islamic political organization. I think what's really notable then is that they really actively explain their political goals in terms that would be recognizable to many foreign audiences. So Hizb Islami, for example, demanded an independent and non-aligned Afghanistan that was self-sufficient and had good relations with the international community, while also pledging, I should say somewhat ironically, to respect human rights. Jamiat likewise pledged to uphold peaceful coexistence and the idea of Afghan self-determination. Not only that, both parties also really actively drew broader parallels. So one Jamiat representative pointedly told a seminar in Washington, D.C., and I quote, "If we fail, no small country in the world can feel safe, and world peace will become even more fragile." So in other words, the goals of the Islamist parties were those of the world community, so political independence and peaceful international relations. Yet at the same time, these ideas were also tailored through the prism of political Islam for what party leaders perceived to be Afghanistan's political, social, and spiritual needs. Not only that, but the refugee crisis precipitated by the civil war in Afghanistan gave these parties additional opportunities to extend their influence. So I look in the book at refugee camps in particular as a site of convergence and conflict for different ideas around rights, humanitarianism, and social and political order. So on one hand, refugee camps and kind of their broader history reflected this much longer and complicated history of the UNHCR, so its own organization, and its attempts to alleviate human suffering. So refugee camps are really sites that were rooted in older histories of Western humanitarian intervention and attempts then by Western agencies to impose order and organization on migrants. But these refugee camps at the same time also became sites that the government of Pakistan and resistance groups used and took advantage of to try to reshape Afghan society and politics. In other words, the refugee camps in which millions of Afghans settled became a site of competition between the UNHCR and Afghan resistance parties. And Afghan resistance groups proved particularly adept at adopting the language of humanitarian crisis to insert themselves as intermediaries between UNHCR officials on one hand and Afghan refugees on another. And what you can't see here, they use political cartoons in particular to really draw on this kind of very widely sort of visual, like widely recognized visual imageries of kind of suffering refugees in order to really pull on kind of the heartstrings of Western donors and to bring further aid and support to the Afghan refugee community. But notably as well, that the extension of Afghan resistance party activities within the refugee camps was also predicated on regional factors. So certainly Jamiat and Hizb Islami were particularly well organized, and that was certainly one of the reasons they rose to the fore of the anti-socialist resistance movement. But equally, their opportunities to extend their influence were shaped by additional regional and international factors. So in Pakistan, General Zia-ul-Haq's focus on Islamization and Pakistani national security translated into support for certain Afghan resistance groups, and particularly Hizb Islami and other Islamist organizations. And this was because Zia, in the regional and national context, particularly sought to restrict the influence of Pashtun ethno-nationalism within Pakistan, and he really wanted to put sympathetic new Afghan rulers into power next door. So it was the government of Pakistan's decision-making that actually made Afghan resistance parties key intermediaries between camp officials and refugee communities. And in turn, this actually forced refugees to join Afghan political parties as the price of receiving humanitarian aid. I should note that likewise, Ayatollah Khomeini also supported Afghan Islamists. And initially, He reached across sectarian divides to offer support to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Hizb Islami, before later on in the conflict focusing increasingly on more Shia Islamist groups and fighters, notably, I should say, some of whom also fought in the Iran-Iraq War before then serving in the war in Afghanistan against the Soviets. So significantly then, because these Islamist groups were particularly well organized and had links to regional powers, particularly Pakistan and Iran, but also Saudi Arabia, they also then, as a consequence, increasingly came to the fore of the resistance movement. So they received exceptional and additional financial and military support from Pakistan's intelligence agency, as well as manpower support from resistance fighters from across the Muslim world. And this in turn had really important political consequences. It fed into a growing political binary then between Afghan socialists on one hand and Islamists on the other. And this binary in turn then left far less room for more moderate or secular reformers, particularly within the Afghan resistance, to sort of take the lead in any potential political negotiations for Afghanistan's future. Oh, well, you get a quote at least. Cool. So, however, while regional support put the Afghan Islamists in a particularly influential position, they were nevertheless constrained by other international factors. So despite the quite radical nature of, and quite radical ambitions, I should say, of parties such as Hizb Islami and Jamiat, foreign actors did not necessarily recognize their ambitious nature. So notably, American analysts, officials, and diplomats really failed to recognize the aspirations of these organizations and instead adopted older British colonial rhetoric that focused on Afghans as tribal, backwards, and resistant to change. So those tropes in particular can appear across American reporting and official documents about Afghanistan. And these ideas were very much linked to kind of British ideas around, British imperial ideas around the notion of the tribe, not just as a socio-political unit, but instead as a unit that had civilizational kind of ramifications. As kind of the tribe is a socio-political unit that was fundamentally backwards and uncivilized. And that was an idea that was really repeated and adopted by American officials during this time. So before, during, and after the Soviet invasion, CIA analysts, State Department officials, members of the NSA, and embassy officials all used these tropes to explain Afghan politics and society. So Theodore Elliott, at the time the American ambassador in Kabul when the PDPA came to power, he compared Afghanistan's erstwhile leader, Muhammad Daud Khan, to the Lakota chieftain Sitting Bull and referred to Afghanistan as his larger tribe. CIA analysts, as you can see here, insisted as late as 1986 that the resistance to the PDPA, the Afghan socialists, consisted almost entirely of traditional leaders with their own so-called tribal objectives who refused to fight outside their tribal regions. Really noticeably as well, they also dismissed Islam as a potential political force across the region. Instead, they argued that Islam could not, and I quote, contain the anger and frustration of the Muslim people uprooted from their traditional milieu. So I think with the power of retrospect, we can obviously see the long-term consequences of this extremely limited view from the United States of both the Afghan resistance and political Islam more broadly. But I think what's so interesting and really significant that it has such a drastically different framing of the Afghan resistance from the one being put forward by different resistance groups themselves. This ambivalence fed not only into American thinking, but also then ultimately into the activities of the United Nations. So there was a real disconnect between UN-led decision-making and negotiations in Geneva and matters on the ground in Afghanistan. So the top-down negotiated Geneva Accords, which ultimately led to the Soviet withdrawal of troops in February 1989, did not stop fighting across Afghanistan. And political agreements that pledged to respect Afghan self-determination failed to create either processes or spaces through which Afghan wishes could be ascertained. So we think one of the things that's really noticeable and has had huge long-term consequences is the fact that the Afghan resistance parties were excluded from the UN-led political negotiations. And this really linked in particular to the United Nations' reluctance to recognize or provide space for non-state actors and state claimants. So I should say, this as an aside, it's noticeable that kind of some of the reasons that the UN offered for not negotiating with Afghan Islamist parties were really tied to earlier debates about recognizing Palestinian Liberation Organization as well. So these kind of longer and very intimate histories about kind of what place do non-state actors have in an international organization. In this specific context, as a consequence, Negotiations for a Soviet withdrawal were actually only then conducted between the PDPA, the Afghan socialists, the government of Pakistan, and there was input then from the Soviet and American governments. So as a consequence of these, these internationally led negotiations were not particularly representative. And I should add that, offers a really uncomfortable parallel, I would say, to the 2020, early 2021 peace talks in Doha as well. But I think it also raises a bigger question too about who gets a seat at the bargaining table in terms of sort of deciding what kind of a post-conflict society should look like at the end of the Civil War, and how this affects matters on the ground. Instead, because these talks were not representative, as we know, civil war persisted in Afghanistan, and instead, what happened instead was violence became increasingly pervasive and systematized, not only within Afghanistan, but in terms of Afghanistan's relationships with kind of regional powers and the international community. So taking this multi-scalar and multi-locational approach, I think what becomes most immediately obvious is that the Afghan crisis was deeply messy. So the Afghan Civil War attracted interest and actors from across the world. So Soviet and American policymakers, officials from the UN and other international organizations, leaders from states such as Pakistan, Iran, India, and China, NGOs from across Europe and North America, as well as resistance fighters from across the Muslim world. All of these different interest groups converged in Afghanistan because they saw the conflict as posing a litmus test, not just for Afghanistan and Afghanistan's future, but for the international order as well. The late 1970s, when this conflict and crisis broke out, were a really unique moment then, when Cold War détente was evaporating, political Islam was emerging as a potent force, and crises of state leadership were really rampant, especially across this region. An uneasy status quo existed in international relations that quickly tipped into chaos thanks to events in Afghanistan, Iran, and elsewhere. But at the same time, I think it was really important that this was also a moment then where a socialist or an Islamist Afghanistan seemed like a viable opportunity. In the 1980s, educated Afghans, both within and outside the ruling elite, drove conversations about Afghanistan's political future. And this was because they positioned themselves as global actors who were taking part in universalist debates about politics, the social contract, and international relations. And Afghan elites' visions of modernity that emerged in part from exchanges with external sources, but they also were increasingly looking to develop models that fit Afghanistan's local circumstances, but could then be further exported abroad. In this regard, I would argue that if we're going to think about Afghanistan as being exceptional, its exceptionalism actually derived from the possibilities it presented as a model, not in contrast to an idea of kind of the West's limited circumscription of what a state should look like. So in that sense, to fully understand the Soviet invasion and the Afghan Civil War, we need to recognize that Afghanistan of the 1980s was a place of potentials as much as a place of political and military failure. Afghan modernizers' ideas and aspirations mattered because they reflected a time and place where it seemed possible that either side could succeed in fundamentally reshaping Afghanistan. Of course, as we know, the civil war between the two sides did change Afghanistan, but not in the ways that either groups hoped for. But exploring then how different actors inside and outside Afghanistan responded to the Tsar Revolution, as Afghan socialists called their coup, as well as the subsequent Soviet invasion, reveals then why none of these visions of Afghan modernity ultimately came to pass. The Afghan crisis of the 1980s derived from politics and interests born in multiple locations, but collectively all of these visions and practices were irreconcilable. Nevertheless, I would argue that many of these factors continue to have influence today, and I hope then that this case study offers important lessons for thinking then both about Afghanistan's past as well as its present and potentially its future. I'll end there. Yeah.
So I had the PowerPoint and I uploaded here. It works on my computer. I don't know what happened here, but maybe we should unshare it so that you have full screen for the audience.
Yeah.
I was gonna come and interrupt, but I did not. I thought it will interrupt the flow of the argument. But as you have seen, this book promises to change the story of Afghanistan, not as a place that is afflicted with traditionalism and isolated from the rest of the world. And Professor Leake showed that, on the contrary, Afghanistan was highly internationally linked, and also it was an area with very highly credible and compelling, but competing visions of modernity and nationhood. And this over-investment in modernity and international networks then became a problem for Afghanistan with all the other contingent factors. So in a way, the crisis in Afghanistan then is a reflection of the crisis of the international order. But Professor Leake kindly agreed to answer your questions and comments, hear your comments. So I will try to moderate it. I made my own humble comments here in terms of summarizing. So the floor is open for your interventions and questions. Professor Leake.
Okay, so thank you so much for this. I cannot wait to read the book and come to very high words of praise. I truly am looking forward to this. Now, you probably have dealt with this to some degree in your book, but you're putting forward these sort of various competing and also at the same time communicating sort of modern notions of nation state that Hikmat or Afghan or the others are putting forward here. I'm curious though that you call all of these sort of things kind of almost there's a failed sort of trajectory that you've got these competing notions and then it somewhere disappears. So I'm curious that to what degree do you actually see the formation of the Taliban state as reflecting these ideals? Particularly asking this because there's a student who I'm advising who's looking right now at the 1996 constitution that I believe never really was ratified or never really put forward, and trying to see like what the various threads are that this particular notion of nation state is pulling from. And as a corollary to that, I'm also going to have to ask that how do you see the Islamist visions of the nation state, which tend to be obviously very sort of well organized and unified, in comparison with, for example, the Gilani, Mujaddidi, Deobandi networks, which then provide so much of the cannon fodder, and then which feed into so many of these various groups that come out.
Yeah, I think that those are, thank you for the questions. I mean, there's so much I could say, but I think one of the things that's really important is that I think the Civil War, kind of what happens, really creates sort of this moment or kind of this moment and set where there's such a diverse milieu of kind of people kind of coming together, particularly in and around Peshawar in Pakistan, where all these debates are taking place about kind of what should Afghanistan's political future look like. And I'd say, I guess, to answer your second question first, I mean, I think one of the things that's really significant, and this is one of the reasons I really say you can't separate out kind of the local developments from the regional and the international, is that very, very intentionally, the government of Pakistan in particular gives space and funding to these Islamist groups to the detriment and, actively undermining more moderate, and so I guess you could almost describe as more secular groups such as Gilanis. I think part of this is to do with concerns, without a question, part of this is to do with concerns about ethnic Pashtun nationalism, which has been kind of a very kind of long-term thorn in the side of Afghan-Pakistan relations. But I think also it really tied to India's own interest in the Islamization of politics that's happening within Pakistan at the same time. So I think the regional factor is really important for kind of why this, why certain visions gain more traction and more followers than others. But at the same time, I do think it is important to recognize this as a moment where there are so many different ideas being sort of mooted about what Afghan society politics could look like or should look like. And I think it's really noticeable, I think, and really important that, so there's a survey of Afghan refugees that takes place in, I think, 1987. And actually what's really interesting is that the majority of Afghan refugees want the king to return. So the king of Afghanistan, who was overthrown in a coup in 1973, rather than one of these Islamist parties to take over. Very notably, then, though, within days, Hizb Islami assassinates the person who conducts this survey. So I think there's also this role of kind of violence amongst resistance groups that plays a really important role in terms of why certain resistance groups are able to be more influential than others, and fear and violence play a very important role in that. I think kind of the ideas of the Taliban are really interesting because certainly kind of the ways that kind of, I guess, the Taliban envisions and ultimately enforces kind of its version of kind of Islamist governance is, in a lot of ways, is very different from what is envisioned, certainly by Jamiat, but also Hizb Islami.
And I think, those ideas are certainly on one hand rooted in local experiences of the Afghan Civil War, but also are part of this kind of, I guess, broader kind of lineage of ideas spreading into and across Afghanistan and the Middle East. But I think it's really noticeable that because of the infighting between these other groups, and particularly the infighting between Hizb Islami and Jamiat in particular, starting in the 1980s, but extending up until 1996, that the Taliban is able to basically come in and instead present its own equally radical but very different vision of what Islamist governance should look like. So I think, I don't know if that entirely answers the question, but I think one of the things we were talking about this earlier today, is the need to take the Taliban's ideas seriously, looking at how those ideas are kind of articulated in the 1990s, as well as the ways they're being re-articulated today. Because if we don't take those ideas seriously, then how can you actually engage with them? And that's not to condone the Taliban in any way, but those ideas matter. So, yeah.
Yeah. Hi, we met earlier today. It's Mark. And my question, and this is kind of focusing on chapter 3, which is looking at Moscow's role. And you mentioned how they broadcast, and this is just one anecdote about how they broadcast Tajik, or I believe it was the Tajik SSR, into Afghanistan. And I was curious as to why you didn't speak to, or you didn't choose to engage with, say, roles, especially in places like, say, Tajikistan, and the Tajik SSR especially, with cross-border connections between Soviet republics and within the Afghan state, and say explore how Soviet leaders thought about that. I know in the interwar era, there was a lot of concern about pan-Turkism, and that was a major Soviet concern. But how did these concerns about the transnational, ethnic transnationalism, I don't know if that's the proper term for it, in Central Asia, impacted how the Soviet Union viewed Afghanistan?
That's a really interesting question. So I'd say I didn't talk about that because there's some other scholars who've done some absolutely super work very, very recently. It was actually the scholarships coming out as my book was going to press about kind of the role of Central Asians in the Soviet conflict. So Artemy Kalinovsky's been really involved in this great translation project in particular that looks at the role of Central Asian translators in particular. It's being really key figures in terms of the Soviet forces within Afghanistan. But I think one of the reasons, one of the other factors I think that really comes out is the fact that the PDPA really adopts the same nationalities policy that the Soviet Union had put forward in much earlier in the 20th century. So I think that was something the kind of Soviet officials certainly embraced as an idea, I think, particularly sort of undermining what was, I guess, of undermining or sort of trying to rectify what has often been seen, and I won't get into the historical debates about kind of this kind of idea of kind of an overwhelming sort of Pashtun presence is sort of dominating Afghan politics and society. So, in that respect, kind of this Tajik presence plays a particularly important role in terms of thinking about creating a space and providing rights for other ethnic communities within Afghanistan. But I think in terms of, I would say I do not speak Tajik, and I definitely did not have the time or the money or the resources to get to Tajikistan to use these archives, which I think there are questions of access there as well. But it's a great question, and hopefully more people will work on it.
Yes.
My question is more broadly about your research specifically. You mentioned at the beginning, obviously, that you were unable to use individual specific Afghan sources. And I was just wondering, in your research specifically, obviously, like everything that's encountered specifically when talking about the Islamic world or the Middle East, you have imperial world remnants or even undertones within translated works or even anything that's written publications. Where would you say that was most apparent? Would you say the materials and sources you were reading that were more Moscow or the United States? Because even the mere use of the word modernity, obviously, and I hope this question is clear enough, but we were just wondering that.
Sorry, I didn't understand the last part.
No, I was just saying, I hope that question was clear enough. I can expand if it was not.
Yeah, no, I think so. In terms of the translations, and I think so I use a lot of English language sources from the Afghan resistance groups or Afghan press themselves. So those are actually translations that are by local Afghan intellectuals and elites. So whether that is Hizb Islami or Jamiat, there were some great pictures of some of that stuff, as well as like the Kabul Times, for example, which again is basically serves as an Afghan government mouthpiece. So I definitely use those ideas, but like in terms of, I was trying to think in terms of the question of translation of the other stuff. I don't
I didn't quite follow the question. I apologize, slightly late in the day. I'm trying to think, so.
Like imperial, and I don't want to be completely frank and speak in Gen Z lingo, but sometimes I feel like when it is this late in the day, that ends up happening. But almost everything we read and everything we see in the materials and the sources in academia specifically have these imperial undertones of formerly imperialized nations, almost like a clash of civilizations type of undertone. And I was wondering when you were reading your sources, was that apparent? And did that affect and impact what you were writing? Were they biased? Were they not biased? And I know that's such a in your face, more, I guess, everyday question, but just out of general curiosity, because you were not able to use the specific sources of Afghanistan or not on the ground as much of a perspective.
I mean, so I think I tried to address that certainly with the American sources, because 100% there is no question in my mind that those kind of imperialist and civilizational undertones, quite frankly overtones, are exceedingly prevalent in American reporting and policy documents on the US and American policy reporting on Afghanistan. And so yeah, you couldn't see the pictures of the images, but I mean, so that's not, it's blatantly there. And I argue that, the real short, if I'm particularly critical of, I guess, any group within this history, it is the United States. And it is for being so utterly reliant on these colonial and imperialist tropes of Afghans as being tribal and backwards, and not taking seriously these ideas that are being put forward by Afghan groups themselves, and kind of these, these ideas of what an Afghan society and politics should look like. The United States certainly had multiple opportunities, working with the government of Pakistan, or, particularly working with the government of Pakistan to kind of force through discussions about political coalitions between the different resistance groups. They did try to do that, but pretty haphazardly later in the 1980s. But because American officials in particular did not take these ideas seriously and were so extremely dismissive of political Islam, not only in Afghanistan, but also in Iran as well, kind of across, especially, and you see this especially, I could say in a very casual sense, especially in CIA reporting, where it's just very dismissive across the board. I think that reliance on kind of colonial ideas of local populations being less civilized really ultimately undermines the America's understanding of the region, and leaves, as we know now, left the United States very underprepared for what happens in 2001. So I'd say it is very important. It's very visual there. I'd say in the other kind of English language sources, the Russian sources I all translated myself, so there weren't necessarily as much sort of discussion, I suppose, of modernity. That was the term I chose to use as a kind of a unifying factor, because I didn't want to I talked about modernity rather than, I suppose, like histories of development, because it's because of the aspiration of utopian nature of how these different actors are talking about Afghanistan's future. Yes, they are talking about sort of infrastructures, but more often than not, it's very kind of utopian in terms of these ideas of what Afghanistan potentially could be. So that's in part kind of my application of ideas, but also then taking very seriously the language that these actors are using. And I think what's really interesting is the fact that, especially you see in a lot of the correspondence or publications of, Jamiat or Hizb Islami or the PDPA, that they are using this very universalist language. So using ideas like human rights or self-determination or non-alignment, or also, trying to intercede in other international crises of the moment as well. So I hope that sort of answers.
Yes, no, it did. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Are you suggesting that the modernist trends in the parties that were emerging were starting to create a sense of nationhood and weakening the tribals systems that were prevalent in Pakistan, Afghanistan, or am I overstating that?
I would say that that's what they wanted to do, and that's what they were trying to do. I wouldn't say they were necessarily successful in doing so. But
Given how quickly things went back to the tribal framework, it seems that, most urban centers try to sort of create a national movement and so on and so forth. The sort of the British American mindset that at the end of the day, it's a bunch of tribes. Seem to have won out at the end.
I'd say yes and no. I think these ideas really matter because they demonstrate that there were a lot of Afghan, I think, obviously very highly educated, very cosmopolitan Afghans were thinking very much in national terms. And were very actively trying to undermine the idea of kind of Afghanistan as kind of organized sociopolitically and around kind of tribes. But that being said, so I think there is a real disconnect. So I talk a lot in the book about kind of ideas on one hand and implementation on the other. And I think what you see, I think particularly with something like Hizb Islam, you see a real failure of the group of this party to be able to implement these ideas, especially without the use of violence.
It pretty much failed all across the Middle East. I mean, there were all kinds of ideas floating around that never went anywhere. I mean, some of it for lack of support, some of it through active repression and so on and so forth. So you were correct that this is not they didn't get a chance to flower the way one might have hoped.
No, yeah, I agree. They definitely didn't. But I mean, I think the big important thing is, especially in this context, is taking those ideas seriously. And because there are certainly moments where they are successful. And I think you particularly see this around, for example, the Panjshir Valley with Shah Massoud and the sorts of policies that he undertakes in that region in association with Jamiat, and the sorts of infrastructures and alliances he is able to create that do transcend and transgress, I guess, tribal divisions or and also various ethnic and class divisions and religious divisions as well.
But from a practical standpoint, it was mostly an anti-Pashtun.
Before I give the question to Professor Juliana Hammer, I thought, since I reviewed this book, I think one of the big achievements of this book is to go beyond the failure narratives and to show Afghanistan as a kind of fertile, creative space to reimagine the war and see Afghan agency in war making. And I think the tragedy is that Afghans internationalize their struggle, their visions, but then other international actors from China, India to Arabia and Arab countries or America, the moment they get involved in supposedly empowering the Afghans for the war, they also brought all of their conflicts into this region. So it became like Lebanon or Ethiopia with certain particularities. Professor Julian Hammer.
Thank you for the talk. Can I have two questions? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. So one is just adding to this conversation already about failure and success, and Jamil knows that I'm not a fan of looking at history in that way. And so I'm wondering if there are perhaps better ways to think about historical narratives and ideas and events, not in a trajectory towards a singular vision of what should have been. And in that, it's not the graveyard of empires, but it's also not the failure of Afghan actors that Afghanistan is basically still at war, right? That if we wanted to blame, I'm a fan, right? Like we need to be critical and we need to critique particular actors. It is precisely, as Jamila was saying, the international interventions by very particular actors that lead to that failure, rather than a, like we want to take Afghan agency seriously, but then the only thing we do with that is say, and they failed at this. That's more of a comment. The question I had, because I'm the resident gender correspondent, is about women in that history. I think I saw something there with a picture, wasn't there, about Rawa? If that's what I think it is, then I'd be really curious if there is a place in your research, and I don't know if in the book, for both women as objects of these conversations, which is certainly something that's already happening in the second half of the 20th century, but also women as actors within that.
Yeah, and to say, so I think kind of your first comment, I completely agree. I feel like success and failure is not a great, I was talking about this, I teach a course in global decolonization, and I'm a student who's like, oh, how much are we gonna talk about how empire was good or bad or success or failure? I was like, that's just not a productive conversation, so we won't be having it. But I think in this book in particular as well, it is the fact that there is then this is what I was saying, it's like, it's not, I mean, yeah, it might not be a very satisfying takeaway from the book, being like, this is an extremely messy conflict. But at the same time, I think it is the thing that is most significant, because you cannot disentangle what's happening on the ground and locally, and the ways that kind of these different resistance groups or the socialists are thinking and acting, the ways in that they're engaging with their regional or international backers, from the ways that then these activities are being debated at the UN General Assembly, and from the ways that the UN High Commission is also intervening very intimately in the lives of Afghans on a daily basis in these camps. I mean, it's so interconnected, and that's something we have to recognize. I think I was saying, I've said in the previous talk, it's like you can't just have a superpower history of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, because it just doesn't actually teach you much. So, you think you have to look at sort of those interactions between those different scales. In terms of the kind of role and place of women, yeah, I talk about kind of the gendered histories of this conflict in terms of certainly in terms of some of the problems of kind of Afghan socialist governance, in terms of kind of how there's a lot of rhetoric about changing the place of women in Afghan society that they don't actually follow through on in practice. And there are also some real tensions as well in terms of I guess the consequences of those policies. I particularly look, I suppose, at the experience of Afghan women in the context of the refugee camps. I think very unsurprisingly, from the perspective of kind of Western NGOs and the UNHCR, kind of women and kind of the role of Afghan women becomes a really key source of focus for international actors who are very, I think, on one hand, they're very perturbed and concerned about the fact that many women observe purdah, or kind of seclusion, within the refugee camps. And on the other hand, too, they very much kind of make Afghan women the targets of what they call self-reliance schemes. So they're very focused on sort of educational schemes that, which bring a lot of Western assumptions and stereotypes to the camps, and in terms of thinking about trying to effectively teach or educate Afghan women how to live their lives in different ways. And I would say, kind of actually linking back to the question about kind of how kind of self-aware are some of these sources, like there are a lot of issues in some of these, like the International Labor Organization, and the sorts of recommendations they're making about like having to teach women better personal hygiene, or like how to boil water properly, and not taking into account the very real knowledge that many women had. And I contrast this actually with some of the anthropological studies that were done at the time about actually why some Afghan women actually actively sought out purdah within the refugee camp as a way of dealing with the extreme trauma of being a refugee and of having had to flee their country, and often having experienced horrific violence against them and their families en route. And so I think one of the things I wanted to emphasize is that purdah for many women was a choice that they actively chose as a source of comfort. And so I think there were obviously some problems with the Western humanitarian rhetoric around that. But what's also then alongside that, to further diversify the story, I do talk about the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan, RAWA, which is a really fascinating, an absolutely fascinating group that still exists. And they're very active both in combating and critiquing the Afghan socialists, and then they're very active in and around Peshawar and Pakistan in terms of trying to promote Afghan women's rights, Afghan women's education, often in conversation with the resistance groups, but equally they often then become the targets of the resistance groups as well. So it's widely believed that Hizb Islami assassinated RAWA's leader in the 1980s, as well as her husband, as well as a lot of the other key leaders. So again, I think the experience of exile and refuginess really sort of shapes, on one hand, it gives RAWA new avenues for opportunities to kind of mobilize women, but also they become increasingly the target of violence from other Afghan groups. So again, it's a very messy history.
But it also underscores that it's not a binary between socialists and Islamists,
Yes.
right? Because RAWA positions itself in really interesting ways, as
Yeah.
you said, against both, but also has a sort of like a really interesting local but also internationalist vision of what should be.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, Afghanistan, of course, is subject to so many contradictory, almost pathological narratives, that, especially on the issue of liberating Afghan women. But I should note that when one of our PhD, the military history general McMaster, was advising Donald Trump. When Donald Trump wanted to withdraw, it's a UNC PhD, by the way. When he withdrew from Afghanistan, he showed the pictures of Covert University from the 70s. Unveiled woman in the survey. We have a mission to protect this woman or go back a these years. And everybody noted as a critique that these were socialist women, but there's also another layer of ignorance that Afghanistan itself has a long tradition of Muslim modernism and Queen Suraya and her proclamations of Muslim reform of women's rights. So I guess in your book, we see that everybody else around the world, including China, I was very impressed by the China chapter and bring their own take on this. And I was going to ask, what do you think about what changed with China's position? Because some of the things that Elisabeth writes about China in 1979, Chinese foreign policy proclamations, I thought this was done by Iran. It's this invasion is going to be the graveyard of the evil Soviet Empire, and the Afghan jihad is going to destroy everything. Chinese foreign ministry. But 40, 50 years past, and they are still there, they are next door. And this story is not over. I guess one of the things that historical insights might help us to deal with the current issue and then maybe also tame and reform the situation. But I'm curious about what will happen in the next chapter with the changing world, because the changing world is still in Afghanistan in that regard. But I didn't want to interrupt because someone else had a question. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, thank you so much for this really helpful talk. I was wondering if you can reflect on the distinction between political Islam of Hizb Islami as a conceptual idealization of their program versus the concrete actualized political program. Did they have a version of how they wanted to implement it as a political program, like the way that Khomeini, for instance, eventually they Islamicized the constitutional democracy and added the guardianship of the clergy? Did they have a way of adjusting a kind of like democratic, as it were, political program and make it somehow a different version of governmentality altogether?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And the answer is yes, but no, which is not very helpful. So one of the things that's really interesting actually, so Hizb Islami and Hekmatyar, the ways that they initially frame their ideas are extremely vague. I think, which is perhaps unsurprising. And there's a lot of kind of rhetoric about what it could be, but kind of in terms of kind of what it means in terms of formal practice is quite vague. Actually, I would say until the mid to late 1980s. And then actually, the charter, which you could see, is really a fascinating document in terms of how it does actually explicitly lay out a more concrete governing system and structure for what his Islamic sort of thought could exist in Afghanistan. But there are still some real tensions in that document in terms of kind of there's a lot of discussion about kind of representational politics and governance and the different sorts of councils that would oversee kind of different areas of governance. So the document does not explicitly recognize that what Hekmatyar really wanted was single party rule. So there is a real kind of tension or kind of disconnect between the fact that in practice, Hekmatyar and Hizb Islami were absolutely notorious for assassinating any and all political opponents across a whole range of parties, resistance groups in Pakistan, resistance groups in Afghanistan, as well as the PDPA. So there was no acknowledgement of kind of that single party rule, but there are, I think, the charter lays out kind of how a central bank would work, kind of what sort of taxation forms would work, and kind of how those would link to Islamic practice, as well as then kind of bringing in these sort of, I don't want to call them more secular aspects, but I guess more universalist aspects. Like the section on land reform is really fascinating. The language that Hizb Islami uses about land reform, it's like very ironically, it's almost verbatim what the PDPA wanted to do, which is kind of in a broader context is really ironic because land reform was one of the activities undertaken by the Afghan socialists that really sparked a lot of local resistance. So I think that some of those overlaps are really fascinating.
Thank you.
We may perhaps have one last question. If you want to let the board start.
I can ask.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I was reading my students and I are reading the book by Malkasian or
Mm.
Malkasian, the American War, and the thing that I really took away from it was he says that the only generals in the ANA that anyone took seriously were communists.
Mm.
The non-communist ones were just basically tribal militias or just mafia types, which raises the question that it seems that communism's kind of been erased by historians in Afghanistan. There is the book coming out about the PDPA by Klementov that's in the works. But even that kind of dismisses the Afghan communists as kind of as Soviet stooges, it's people who didn't really have anything original to offer. So where does communism fit? I have the book, I haven't read it yet, unfortunately. Where do the communists fit in for you?
Yeah.
You talked a lot about the Islamists.
I mean, I think one of the things that's so fascinating, I completely agree, it's, what's really interesting is, I completely agree that kind of the history of the Afghan communists, I call them socialists because I don't think they're.
Well, that's what they call
Yeah,
themselves.
That's
yeah.
what they call themselves, but, I mean, there is something significant and fundamentally ironic to the fact that the PDPA, yes, it changes its name and becomes Hizb ut-Tahrir, so kind of the party of the homeland, but it outlasts the Soviet Union, right? So the Soviet Union, it collapsed. Najibullah, who's the head of the evolved PDPA, remains in power until 1992. So I think there's, the fact that this party in its various iterations manages to not only outlast a superpower, but also to remain in power itself for 14 years is really significant. So the fact that it has this staying power, I think is really, really important. But also I think too, like the ways that, I guess in longer terms to kind of, the kind of Afghan socialist diasporas had, I think, really prominent and has been really influential kind of across the world as well, which is really, really interesting. But, I think one of the things that I really emphasize, I suppose, especially with thinking about the rise of the PDPA is that in a lot of ways, they're not very exceptional in the 1970s, and they really try to make that point. I mean, so they see themselves, this party sees itself just like any other socialist party across the world. They actively celebrate Ethiopia Week, for example, Ethiopia Solidarity Week, and they justify policies like land reform by saying, well, all these other countries are doing it. Like, why can't we do it here as well? And, and you look at, in a variety of kind of decolonizing states. So they're really, I think that's really important, but I think what really falls down to this kind of how quickly they try and abandon a lot of these policies in practice. But I think those ideas are really important. And I mean, the fact that they do remain in power for so long and then when everything sort of falls apart in 1992, these new alliances emerged between former communist generals. I mean, just like Dostum is the key example of that. With kind of some of these other resistance groups, I mean, shows their longevity as well. But yeah, I completely agree that they've been underwritten. I have other feelings about McCasey's book, but I won't go there.
Well, I guess we will conclude. So before I conclude, I say that this book indicates that how the problem in Afghanistan cannot be blamed on the people. It's almost like the international community were the arsonists, but then they blame the fire on the people as being pyromaniac. But you show that there are shortcomings and problems of all the international actors and narrative that kind of contributed to the situation we are in Afghanistan. But Professor Leake is now writing a broader history of decolonization. So hopefully we will have you for your third book when it's out and the 20th century decolonization. I also found out, I didn't know it until today, that she has family members who were Japanese Americans in internment camps, and some family documents and archives and some videos. I hope that you will also do the personal family history that I would like to read, or the museum exhibit sometimes. But we'd like to thank you a lot for your generous time, and since 12:30.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I know. And I thought it was I'm Aaron.
Thank you.